sorry, I'll start with you. And I think because we made the first connection together to start with. I met Lynn last year during the World Heritage Committee in Delhi, and we had very interesting discussions. So in many years, we could say, working in the field of heritage, treading into very difficult areas, writing, as you have put it, very, very well phrased, an ethnography of UNESCO and its role. If I ask you to make a brief introductory remark to this session, what would you say? What would you say about your career and your time treading into heritage and international organizations and conflicts? So I'll just invite you to give an opening remark.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Aziz, and thank you for hosting us here through our days in Oman and seeing your fantastic sites, both natural and cultural. Just briefly, I was trained as an archaeologist first. I did my archaeology in Egypt, also in Turkey, and then for the last 15 years, I have worked on the. Keep it closer, Lafish. Thank you. So for the last 15 years, doing an ethnography of World Heritage, because as an archaeologist, I had worked at many archaeological sites that were World Heritage properties, but we hold them up as the most important somehow, but we don't really understand how UNESCO works. So as an archaeologist from 2011 onwards, I wanted to study the processes by which some sites are inscribed, others are not. Some communities are recognized, others are not. Why some countries are more powerful in that UN system than others. So I came with a very rosy view of what international organizations were, and I got a very big education very fast. So it became a very political project. So why the World Heritage List was dominated by European properties, the composition of the committee. I know that Oman has served on the committee, but it is often dominated by European nations. I'm Australian, where is the Pacific in all of this? So it's impossible to write a book. I did write something called A Future in Ruins without being political. So much of my work is also on conflict. The first book I did as a student is called Archaeology Under Fire, and it is about the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And the under fire bit is that archaeologists have also contributed to the conflict. So it is not we as victims, it's we as part of the problem. So I just want to clarify that, because sometimes the title, so our discipline is under fire, right, for sometimes very good reasons. So that's the background of my work. I've just come from Oman, from Jordan, that has incredible archaeology, incredible heritage practitioners, my colleagues there. So I'm always very happy to learn and learn from you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lynn, for this. And we'll get back to you with more questions, maybe questions from myself and also questions from the audience. I think I'd like to now turn to Professor Trinidad Rico, and to really, I know that you have worked in the Middle East for some time, both for your initial work. You had many books on heritage and Islam, and I think your last book that was very recently published, the Heritage State. Yes, I'm very happy that we will be the recipients of this book. Thank you very much. So I think in that book you address many of the topics that we are talking on the international level, but maybe apply it on the region. And maybe also give us a few words before you take us into a journey with your presentation and the launch of your book.
Thank you. See, I'm doing it right. Thank you, Professor Aziz. It's a pleasure to be here and to meet your students and colleagues, and to be back in Oman, having been here for 20 years. My journey in heritage studies began in Southeast Asia. I actually worked in Indonesia for my PhD, so my concern with representation, representation in the Muslim world began in Indonesia, and it's only after I finished that project that I realized that we had a lot of literature on other regions of the world, but not a lot of interesting debates about Islam, about heritage stewardship, about caretaking practices, other than the obvious debate on terrorism and destruction. So my second project, which is resulted in this book, is really concerned with talking about the region in positive terms as a place that generates culture and tradition and continuously generates culture and tradition. So that's really where I'm coming from. So it's a lot of the work is inspired by Professor Meskell's work in paying attention to these state institutions and how they have included or excluded the Arab states, the Muslim world, the global south. And my case study ended up being Qatar, because I ended up living in Qatar for 5 years, so I thought it was a good place to study it. Oman could have been also a really good place to study some of these questions, and hopefully we can, afterwards in a conversation, to your questions and comments, we can think about ways in which these concerns sometimes can translate to other parts of the GCC. Thank you.
I think just get a bit of sure you can hear me. Maybe I think we will give the time for Professor Trinidad to present her book, and then that will give us also more material to come to the discussion and to the conversations. Thank you for the introduction, and I would really invite you to maybe to the podium and
I probably need a mic.
Can somebody please check the link, because I'm receiving some comments that the link is not working, so please just can you check if the link is working.
Right, let's see if this works. I'm very short for a podium. I'm used to it though. Is this ready to go? Do you know if this is ready? Okay.
Just
I'm gonna self-manage this.
Is it there?
Check me out. Yes. I did it. Now this keeps coming on and off. We need it for the online, but I can also project my teaching voice to the back. Is this working? Okay, good. Sorry, it's sending me messages. I apologize. All right. Here, I need a little bench. So as I was saying, some of my work is concerned with locating the idea of what local heritage means. What does it mean to do things not, as we were saying, coming from Europe, but thinking about things as they are generated here. The expertise, the debates, and how this is explained by understanding a little bit of how heritage emerges as an idea, how institutions travel around the world. And I developed a focused interest in figuring out why heritage debates for the region have been so poorly developed over the last few decades. Here I build on some of the work that Professor Meskell did in her previous book, A Future in Ruins, and I recommend this book to everyone. I know now it's been a few years, but it's a really good starting point to understanding these challenges at a global level. In December 2001, specialists in Muslim law and religion convened in Doha, Qatar, for the Doha Symposium of Ulama on Cultural Heritage, chaired by His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, then Emir of the State of Qatar. Through the involvement of Muslim scholars, the meeting was organized to formulate the point of view of Islam regarding the preservation of cultural heritage. Earlier that year, in February 2001, the Taliban leadership in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan had successfully and theatrically destroyed the 6th and 7th century Buddhist statues at the Valley of Bamiyan. Despite international and institutional outcry, in the weeks preceding this event, the leader of the Taliban issued a religious edict that condemned non-Islamic statues and sanctuaries across the country, arguing that the ulama had not advanced any convincing religious arguments to prevent the destruction of the statues. Against this backdrop, attendees of the Doha Symposium drafted what we just saw, the Doha Statement, a consequential document laying out principles for preserving cultural heritage. The foreword of this statement declared that Muslims can neither approve nor sanction the intentional destruction of any part of human heritage. I'm sorry, I'm not changing anything, it comes on and off. It also called for strengthening the Muslim religion's tolerance of pre- and non-Islamic heritage. The recommendations contained in the Doha Statement are unique. They join other advisory documents on matters of cultural protection and understanding under the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Do we need to shift? Okay, is that better? Oh, that's a very different voice. Still me. Contrary to the widely circulated documents such as the Hague Convention of 1954, which sets the standard for safeguarding heritage during wartime, the Doha Statement is a lesser-known but significant collaboration between UNESCO and key regional organizations that represent a vast majority of the Muslim world, the OIC, ISESCO, and ALEXO. Until then, representation of Muslim voices in terms of expertise and authority in heritage have been very limited in the history of UNESCO's culture sector. For example, in his forthcoming book, on the left, Yasser Madraswala examines earlier attempts at governing the conservation of Islamic architectural heritage. One of these is the Lahore Principles of 1980, a document that he argues was more concerned with making the Venice Charter applicable to the Islamic world than with engaging with religious values and traditions meaningfully. Madraswala also examines another doctrinal document, the Cairo Declaration of 2002, which compiles some of the issues and principles from international charters. But as Brika Rudolph argues, and that's the book on the right, which I highly recommend, some of the issues and principles from international charters are not easily applicable to sacred heritage. And her book on the right is basically the foundation for a lot of the conversation about how we can think about Islam and heritage in the Western literature. The fact is that heritage traditions and religious traditions have not been easily reconciled, not just for Islam, but for religion in general. On the one hand, we know that religious landscapes and objects have been a key feature of the rise and establishment of global heritage and preservation. Damage to religious structures in Europe, such as the Coventry Cathedral, a victim of the 1940 Blitz, the bombing during the Second World War, inspired UNESCO's heritage safeguarding mission, amongst other sites. And this is the kind of image on the left that was heavily circulated. And again, I want to plug in A Future in Ruins, Professor Meskell's book, to understand this context. Another structure representing a religious tradition iconic in UNESCO's mission is the pharaonic temple complex to Ramses II at Abu Simbel, Egypt. Clearly, religious traditions have been heritagized easily under certain conditions. Things get more complicated when it comes to living religious heritage with active religious stewardship and use. Most notably, as an example of this crisis, President Erdogan's announcement of the conversion of Hagia Sophia from a museum to an active mosque, and the institutional and global reactions to this transformation demonstrate the conflicts between heritage management and religious management and stewardship. This conflict, which started in the late 19th century for Hagia Sophia, is central to UNESCO's engagement with religious authority. The early years of UNESCO's work reveals the extent to which secularism, right, so just not like undermining religious authority, was the preferred doctrine for the advancement of universal heritage. As early as 1945, the nascent UNESCO was confronted with the challenge of accommodating regional orientations within the universalizing aspiration of UNESCO. Important for this discussion, a 1945 letter to the President of the Commission from the head of the Iraqi delegation calls attention to the lack of members from Arab-speaking countries in the formation of a new executive committee for UNESCO, despite the eligibility of 5 delegations that were present at the time. This delegate writes that none of the states was elected to represent the views and hopes of the Muslim world in the deliberations of the executive committee, would naturally indeed be effective cooperation between the Middle Eastern states and the European and American nations represented in UNESCO, a condition which is not in harmony with the spirit of universal cooperation. UNESCO's indirect response during this formative year, when a lot of these ideas were formed, was found in the declaration that UNESCO cannot base its outlook on one of the competing religions of the world against the others. The general philosophy of UNESCO should, it seems, be a scientific world humanism, global in extent and evolutionary in background. And I note when I explain this to my students, I know that the delegate from Iraq wasn't necessarily saying there should be more Islam in UNESCO. He was saying there should be more representation of the region in UNESCO. It was just taken very literally on this keyword in order to undermine this request. In the young intergovernmental organization then, whose original motto was peace in the minds of men, religion was framed as a potentially contentious truth pitted against rational truth, and as such, one of the contributing factors to the disruption of peace. So it had a very negative connotation. Its growth was influenced by a leadership that recognized the existence and value of religious traditions for humankind, but restricted religious ways of seeing and being in the efforts to define new paradigms for culture, education, and science. The first Director General of UNESCO, Julian Huxley, was a non-member of the Rationalist Press Association. That's something that Professor Meskell also mentioned in your work, whose members were considered religion to be the main threat posed to society. The result of this type of influence was a mandate that proposed the pursuit of objective truth to circumvent divisive traditions and practices. This would have very severe effects on how we think about heritage over the next few decades. If we don't think that religious authority can be taken seriously or it has a place in that table, then obviously the way that the World Heritage List will develop and management strategies will develop is going to be affected by this. Perhaps it's not surprising that during the early decades of heritage internationalism, representation of stewardship from Muslim majority countries in the work of UNESCO was weak and hurriedly contained, marked by tense relations between UNESCO and the Arab states in particular. And these countries were the ones often advocating for Muslim representation as well. Some of these tensions were driven by the persistence of colonial and neo-colonial policies by states whose representatives held powerful sway in international governance institutions. For example, Resolution 181, the UN Partition Plan for Palestine, shook the trust of the region in the United Nations. At the very same time, a push for the establishment of a Near East and Middle East cultural center, it had various names, was met with significant resistance in Paris, marking a very short but intense period of negotiations between 1947 and 1949, aimed at increasing representation and support for the Arab states in UNESCO. And nothing was concretized, but a lot of work resulted in a lot of definitions of where the Arab states are, what they mean, what Arabian culture is. It was also during this time that Huxley, the Director General, toured the Middle East in search for regional experts and leaders loyal to the mission. These efforts seem contradictory, but in fact, give an indication of the specific ways in which UNESCO sought to engage the Muslim world, largely through the advocacy of the Arab states, and focused on its heritage and historic resources, not necessarily its voices, right? So what the institution is doing in this period of time is becoming very interested in all the archaeological sites and the heritage, but not necessarily the experts and the people and the community surrounding it. Sorry, I lost my page. No, I have to find it. This is a good time to think of the question you're going to ask me. Great. This was not the only regional group that felt restrained by the dynamics of the organization. In 1952, the UN General Assembly was warned of an eventual withdrawal from the organization of various Asian and African nations who rejected the polarizing and destructive ideology of the Cold War. By April of 1955, so you can see this is happening very quickly. I mean, at this stage, we've only done 10 years. In the Bandung conference in Indonesia, Asian and African states voiced their opposition to colonialism and neocolonialism propelling the formation of the non-aligned movement against major power blocs. It was clearly an increasing influential non-European membership that called on UNESCO to improve mutual appreciation between, at the time, what they called Eastern and Western values, right? We know it's not that simple, but that's how all the documentation talks about it. Relevant for the development of heritage policy decades later, an initiative called East-West Major Project concluded that Eastern cultural values are primarily defined by spiritual, not material riches. Such an assertion justified disconnecting living religious practices and their communities from the archaeological and historical resources that were cherished and acknowledged by the Western-oriented organization. So again, this is what I mean when I say that a lot of definitions are being set up at the time that then have huge influence on how we can operate. Moreover, this type of work weaponized and misled the idea that the East, the Orient, if you will, had no capacity to handle their own tangible resources, right? If they don't understand material culture, then how can they possibly be good heritage managers? Muslim majority states finally made an impact in the organization in other, more gradual ways after the 1960s, gaining visibility and authority in matters of heritage preservation over the decades, and expertly engaging with UNESCO's global discourse while also growing their own brand of heritage preservation, which is what my book really deals with in the specific context of Qatar, how Qatar is doing the international thing on one side, and also locally developing a very specific heritage discourse and practice. And a lot of these institutions that emerge and initiatives are replicating some of the UNESCO elements, like the Heritage in Danger list and stuff like that. Within UNESCO, the specific ways in which regions were created in this period affected the ways in which different concerns and agendas can be allocated. I'm going to try to explain this complicated slide. As a relevant example for heritage in this region is that over time, Muslim majority states are no longer contained within the Arab states. It's a much broader area of the world. So any concerns with representation of, say, Islam in the list that is being handled by the Arab states is actually very limited because there's many more countries that also have concerns to do with their religious heritage, for example, right? An interest in representing Islamic preservation, previously ignored in Eurocentric preservation efforts, has since been on the rise in the construction of national identities, and interest in the topic of heritage and religion has increased in the 2000s through limited, dedicated initiatives, but these mostly fail to leave a significant impact on heritage management and advocacy, in my opinion. And just to kind of wrap up and bring full circle, I think one of the biggest challenges we have here is that another challenge for the evolution of heritage debates for the region is that dedicated efforts at creating influential sectors also came at a time when the Arab states and Muslim majority countries have to deal with the representation of Islam as being hostile to heritage because of what's happening in conflict zones, right? So unfortunately, the Taliban's actions were not the only isolated crisis featuring the Muslim world during this period. We also have the destruction of 15th century shrines in the Malian city of Timbuktu by Al-Qaeda affiliated Islamist group, and the theatrical erasure of ancient and historic sites by ISIL in Syria and Iraq starting in 2015. So this is also, on one hand, the organization is very interested in understanding religion and heritage, but on the other, we have all these terrible case studies that are having to be navigated and that we see circulated in the media, portraying a very negative sense of the region, right? Or like a negative association. These incidents are accompanied by countless reports in popular and academic circles on the looting, bombing, erasing, and terrorizing of archaeological sites and museums across the region. So that's something that I think we need to consider when we think about how the region is represented. Why don't I stop there so we can just have some questions and engage in conversation, because this leads in really well to Lynn's work, right? I'm just going to leave this slide here because I think it's really interesting to remember how much support there is for the heritage brand in this region, despite all of its shortcomings, right? So despite the fact that the system is not perfectly suited, in my research and opinion, to support some of the heritage stewardship in the region has nonetheless certainly supported and showed intention to further support, in particular through the intensification of the tentative list. So it's a very interesting crux that we're in at the moment, in which the history says it's not going to do well, but then the nations of the region are incredibly positive about trying to get into the system. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that. Thank you for a very interesting insight and opening into a lot of hot topics and a lot of debates. Really interesting, the relation with UNESCO, the perception of Islam, the targeting of certain sites, and what you said in the end, having to deal with all of this within an overall hostile environment in general for Islam and Islamic countries with Muslim majorities. So that was really very enlightening and opening the floor for more questions. I'll still go back to you, and maybe I know that your book was primarily on Qatar, but your presentation was for the interest of the audience, took us on a wider journey, and as you said, touched a lot on also Lynn's work. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the situation in Qatar as a neighboring country with a lot of dedication to heritage. I think it would be interesting to explore that. So maybe,
yeah. Thank you. I mean, obviously, I want everyone to read the book, and if I had fitted it in my luggage, I would have brought 35 copies. But what I think is interesting, Qatar could have, obviously, I think it's very relevant for these questions, that it could have picked any country in the Arabian Peninsula. And I think all of the countries here are great examples of thinking about this situated, right, so localized generational approaches. A lot of the work that Professor Meskell and I do is to think outside of this European center of gravity, doing ethnographic work, right, so work about Australian anthropology, and thinking about how are people really valuing their landscapes, how are they using their landscapes, not because of this convention in Paris was written about, in this way, but what is really happening on the ground. So some of the ideas here could translate really well to thinking about what's next for Oman in some ways, right? Like what's next? I mean, Qatar was coming after today, had done their thing, and maybe now you guys are doing a thing. So the interesting thing about a country like Qatar is that it had two different processes, two different industries happening at the same time. One, very globally oriented, right? Being very high up in the World Heritage Committee, being involved with the funding of UNESCO itself, being involved in decision making, becoming a very active player in a system that is not perfect for the region, but at home, doing something that makes sense at home, by developing heritage in other ways. So you have two different markets, and I think it's really liberating, and it's to me the future of thinking about heritage, that there can be two systems coexisting, right? A lot of the conversations about doing heritage as a post-colonial field, global South-oriented, not necessarily Eurocentric, has been about finding these locally rooted ways of doing things, but it doesn't negate participating in the global as well. Right? So there's a lot of strategy and negotiation in the countries of the GCC of what fits are for the global audience and what fits up for the local audience. That's kind of the overarching sense of, I think, the utility of thinking of a book like this.
Thank you. I think that brings the discussion of the heritage and politics to the forefront, where the use of, maybe State of Qatar, as you said, played a major role at UNESCO. There was a funding and it was being present there, and that was to really put heritage on the pedestal that then served its local agenda in nominating sites, establishing world-style museums and so on. So thank you, and the book will be available in the library, so if you would be interested to do that. Let me go to Lynn, and then after Trini's presentation, maybe I'll just ask you a blunt question after what we've seen, for example, in the debate. I know you were there as well, of, for example, I don't know, some communities, some cities, Liverpool, Dresden, and others say, okay, I don't want to be on the World Heritage List. It doesn't really mean anything to me. What is UNESCO doing for us anyway? So let us just take this discussion further and tell me what you have been exploring or what's your comment on that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, this plays into some recent research I've done with Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania, so working with political scientists. We looked at 1,200 World Heritage properties, so 1,200 across the world, not just sites in danger, as we saw, but all sites. And we looked at what's called sentiment analysis. So we looked at how the media and reports, whether it's World Bank or UNESCO, are reporting on these 1,200 properties that are supposed to be about world peace, and we just saw this idea of creating peace in the minds of men. And we looked at the reports, the newspapers, for positive and negative sentiment. Are people protesting? Are they on strike? Are they getting benefits? Are there jobs being created or being destroyed? And when we looked at those 1,200 properties, we found that inscribing World Heritage sites now creates more conflict than cooperation. So local people feel excluded. They feel like the promises of economic benefits haven't worked out for them. And that doesn't matter whether it's happening in Italy or India, two places I have worked. And it's very clear that the dream of creating this sort of world peace model has now taken a backseat compared to business development, international companies coming in, and local people, local communities, whether they're in villages or cities, feel excluded. So I think it's very sad that the original promise and the luminaries that we heard Professor Rico just mentioned, even people like Julian Huxley, who, a British scientist, kind of did a better job than we're doing currently. So this idea of world peace is actually generating all sorts of conflict. And that is not specific to the Middle East, and I think that's a very important point. I see that happening in Asia. We've seen it with indigenous groups, whether in Australia, across the continent of Africa. So we've got to think more about what we do and what we inscribe. So I think that's very important, and in fact that plays into a new book that I'm doing, which is about a heritage of war. And right at this moment, in 2 days' time, UNESCO is going to host a meeting, an expert meeting, on civil and military partnerships. And I just want you to think about what that means. I've just come from NATO, right, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that alliance. So military organizations the world over are now talking about what heritage means. Destruction, preservation, rebuilding, all of the strategies. And the cultural organization UNESCO built to overcome war is now in discussion with militaries. So what have we found ourselves in? And of course, lots of people would point to Islamic State. I would point to China, India, and Russia. And I would also point, since we're not being recorded, to the United States and its the invasion of Iraq. There are many instances where this has happened. So this is the world we find ourselves in. It's not simply about conservation anymore, it's about powerful states. And it's very easy to be critical of non-state actors because they will never be in the room with us. They will never be at the UN Security Council. But we will not censure certain countries over what's happening in Gaza. We will not talk about the Uyghurs in China. We will not have those debates. There will not be those resolutions because it's about states and their agendas.
Well, that's a very powerful statement, and I'm happy in quotation mark of you mentioned the situation in Gaza. That's something that we feel very strongly about, and the chair has tried to host on many occasions, actually live streaming of what is happening in the cultural heritage sites in Gaza, the museums that has been disrupted. And, it is very difficult at the moment to talk about heritage, politics, and conflict without really pointing to the intentional destruction that is happening with the idea of eroding the identity and making sure that nothing is remaining there that is reflective that there was a nation. Has there been any discussions lately, Lynn, that you've been into regarding the situation in Gaza that you could report to us?
As you mentioned, we were in the meetings in Delhi in July. It was very clear that UNESCO is finding it very difficult to either put people on the ground or do any reporting, and it's much easier to just say it's not possible at this moment. Of course, the situation is different in Ukraine, and these are all political decisions, right? We know what's happening. We have satellite imagery. UNESCO has its own satellite imagery. We know what's happening in Gaza, but politically it remains, and that's not just the United States, that's also European countries don't want to talk about it. Whereas many, they formed a coalition to talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there are many hypocrisies. I would say that while UNESCO may feel it cannot intervene, and it can only, of course, intervene with World Heritage properties, so it doesn't care about historic neighborhoods. It can't not care, but it cannot support that. NGOs are stepping in to make the difference, and I know we have people from World Monuments Fund, and they have been extremely brave to work in Palestine, to work in the West Bank, to support NGOs that are there, to partner with people who have done this work for decades, right? Not on World Heritage properties, but all sorts of heritage. And I think it's the failure of states to support the UN system broadly, and particularly at UNESCO, that has led to this situation. And we have the rise now of NGOs like Aleph, like World Monuments Fund, Europa Nostra. There's many also local to Syria, to Iraq, that we never talk about, but they're doing the work on the ground to support all sorts of heritage, not just the 1,223 sites that a government decides is the most important. So I think we need this mosaic of actors, civil society groups, and dare I say, also the rise of private-public partnerships. We have too much, and too much is under threat, so we need all sorts of actors, I think, to align together, but always to ask people what they need first and foremost.
Thank you. Maybe we've been talking and it's a bit maybe depressing a little bit, but let me open the floor to some questions. If we have any questions, we have a lot more to talk about, but that will be very nice since we're not a very big group to engage the audience. So the floor is open if you really want to have any questions. Please have some mics and can do that. Okay. Well, I think, yeah, it is a lot to maybe build in, and until we have a question? Oh, yeah, we have one? Okay, very good. Maybe just an introduction, if you can introduce yourselves. I just would like also please to remind you, until the technology is on our side, to make sure that you register on the QR code, because it helps us to keep a record of friends of the chair and to be able to communicate with you in the future. So thank you for doing that.
Okay, hi. My name is Aisha. I'm an urban planning and architectural student here at GeoTech, currently doing my 4th year. And my question is regarding what Professor Trinidad said at the end, that it's very difficult to have representation in UNESCO due to groups like the Taliban showing that they already have a history of destroying valuable monuments that tell the stories of our ancestors. Has there? I was just wondering, has there any efforts regarding UNESCO to investigate Islam as a religion rather than the representation? Because Islam by far means peace, and rules such as our warfare to not knock down any tree, to not strike any mosque, church, or temple. We're very respectful in that sort. So has there ever been investigations regarding that to say this is not Islam, these are the acts of terrorists and extremists that paint Islam a lens that is not appropriate?
Thank you, Rachel. That's a great question and comment. And I think you're hitting at the center of the challenge here from where I'm looking at. And we both have different research foci, but mine has been very passionately driven by this. The first thing I want to say is that representation is not reality. Representation is an instrument, right? It's aided by certain forms of media. I am sure many people have read Edward Said's work. One of the books is precisely about media and representation, right? So we have to take with a pinch of salt. It's there and it's circulating in certain environments. The global heritage discourse is very geared towards Western representation, so it gets fed this for a lot of convenient purposes. I mean, it's just part of the heritage making industry in the West to do these acts of safeguarding, right? So that's one thing that we know is just one realm of someone's reality. The reality on the ground, for anyone who has spent any time in the most Muslim countries in the world, would know that that has nothing to do with reality. So it's not so much a matter of whether UNESCO wants to invest in investigating. There's nothing to investigate. There's reality, and then there's representation, right? We don't need a research project to determine this. There's just politics, there's violence, there's people being attacked and oppressed for who they are, there's Islamophobia. Those things are real, and they're happening. My concern for now 10 years plus has been that because heritage has been so focused on the problem of conflict and terrorism, which is real, and we need to think about it and talk about it. But all of our brain cells have been put on that, the money has been put on that. So when you want to learn about the region, and you say type heritage Islam on any database, you only find that. So all we can really do, all you guys can do who are studying this field, interested in this, talking about this, is just talk about the other stuff for me. It's about fighting representation with representation, right? The Muslim world, which is enormous, needs different forms of representation in heritage studies. The blame here is on the field, is the way we teach about it. Like when I come and take, by the way, I brought material for the MA that I teach. If anybody feels like moving to the United States for a year and a half, I'm going to leave it in the UNESCO Chair until you establish your own program. You guys can come and train with me. How much it matters what you teach in class, right? How it shapes your worldview. Your professors make that decision. You don't decide what you're going to learn. The professors decide, right? So how much as professors, and you guys as future professors, maybe, have the power to decide how we represent different regions, right? How sophisticated are they? There's now literature in local space that's exciting, that's about the development of museums, about nation building, about community, right? So much you can write more about Oman. This could be an exemplary case study of community-led, bottom-up ideas of heritage value. So, you know what I mean? So like we just need to fill the space with this really great reality in publication form, unfortunately, and open people's eyes to the fact that it's the areas being misrepresented. That makes sense.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I have another question for Professor Lynn, if that's okay. You mentioned at the end that a lot of areas have been under conflict, like Gaza and the Uyghurs in China. My question is, where would it stop if we're letting atrocities like this happen under the radar? And I understand that it's completely political, but in your opinion, what efforts can be made for destructions such as, Gaza and Uyghurs to be reduced in the future?
Thank you for your question. A very difficult question. I guess my point is that these sorts of tensions happen all around the world in different ways. And the study I mentioned from Wharton that we did about to publish is also many types of dissatisfaction. It doesn't just mean armed conflict. I work in India. There is a lot of dissatisfaction around sites like the Taj Mahal, where all of the economic development is being pushed back. There's issues, religious tensions in the local community. There are many types of dissatisfaction that happen around World Heritage properties. I'm sure we can think of many that we've seen. There's been protests in Italy where they've said UNESCO out. We don't want the listing anymore, right? Italy, that has the most World Heritage sites, right? So this is not something specific to the region. In terms of, well, lessening that dissatisfaction obviously has to include much more citizen ground-up involvement, even selecting the sites. And if I can just switch gears a little to show the implication of this, a study that a colleague and I did looking at Mosul and Aleppo, when people are actually asked what they want preserved, rebuilt, what are the priorities, they're not UNESCO sites. They're the local souk, the historic mosque in their city. They don't want to necessarily visit an archaeological site. So we don't, even this heritage field, we don't ask what people's priorities are in terms of heritage. So that's why there is a general alienation, whether you're sitting in a city in Syria or whether you're in a city in India or Italy. It's the lack of involvement, engagement, inclusion. I'm Australian. We learned this very early on, that if we didn't include Aboriginal people, we were missing out on everything. And so now our nominations are much more Aboriginal-led. Now, if we got a different government in our last election a few weeks ago, maybe that would change. But right now, we have what's called the Labor government, and so there's much more interest in Indigenous issues, environment, and that's what guides our nomination process. If you look at our recent history, Canada is another nation that does the same. So indigenously led. And when our study looked at those nominations, we found that there is more peace and cooperation around the site. It's a very simple equation. If we think about the hypocrisy of why some conflicts are covered, others are silenced, so much of this is about what nations have ratified the international criminal courts, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Is that conflict going to come? It probably will be at the ICJ, the court. ICC, Ukraine is preparing, although it's not a signatory. It's being helped by the United States, which is not a signatory and never will be. So there are all sorts of hypocrisies, not just in heritage, but in international law as well. And I know we talked, Trinidad also mentioned the Cold War. We are back in the Cold War with the allies and adversaries, whether that plays out in the UN Security Council, which I also work on, or the criminal courts, and who's getting prosecuted and who's not even being discussed. And in the case of Gaza, not even being discussed.
Thank you, Lynn, for the comments. And maybe if I can just add, Gaza compared to the Sudan, for example, is very heavily covered. Gaza compared to Libya, where there's the major destructions in Bani Ghazi of world heritage sites and different heritage sites. In Yemen, where they've been recently, were complete neglect on world heritage sites. So even compared to other countries, maybe just out of interest, that 45% of the world heritage sites endangered exist in the Arab states. So out of we possess the majority, almost the majority of the world heritage sites in one region. And that there is very little coverage on that. So I think maybe just for the interest of many, of course, the concerns about having World Heritage Sites and in the few committees that took place, whether in Delhi or before that in Riyadh and many others, I always find it very interesting to listen to the debates where UNESCO refuse certain projects or say decide that these projects are going to go on the endangered list or going to be delisted. Because, for example, the community needs a development item, like a dam, or like the community needs to live close to the site, or the community, as in our case, want to build their houses with different material, maybe not, mud architecture in all the time. So, out of that, I'm not saying that, listening to the community and listening to the development needs is really always very problematic, and it's on that basis that UNESCO sometimes refuse certain projects because they say, oh no, you cannot have both. But this is the same organization that only included in 2012, almost, I don't know, my math is very bad, since the 1972 convention, only in 2012 UNESCO recognized communities as one of its strategic objectives. And I really like to, when I have the chance to also comment on the original emphasis on which the World Heritage Convention was established or got into existence, which is the Abu Simbel site in Egypt, where the world celebrates the site as the beginning of world heritage and the international collaboration. When the Nubian diaspora that also occurred because of the establishment of the high dam were expelled from the same area. And when the whole world collaborated to re-erect Abu Simbel on the banks of the Nile, no international organization, including UNESCO or anybody else, has actually asked about the communities that were living also there, and they were also, their villages were covered by water, but the international community only rescued the monuments. So I think the issue of the community is a very strong issue, especially when we talk about a convention that is very much focused on the concept of conservation and looks, at it very much as an aftersight to the concept of community. So I just wanted to maybe make I'm not the guest, but I think that I can just make a quick intervention. And maybe also, Taisha, I want to tell you, there is a bright hope with regard to Islam. A few years ago, I think almost 10 years ago now, we have managed to list on the World Heritage Days an international day for Islamic art. That was actually very nice for us because it's on the 18th of November, so we in our men have a special day as well at that time, or around this time. I know now there's different, not exactly the 18th, but that was really very interesting debate, and maybe over coffee or lunch I can tell you what interesting discussions were in the executive committee to refuse the listing of Islamic art, just Islamic art, which is an international discipline within architecture. But just listing because it has the word Islamic, it was very problematic, but we were very much supported and it actually went through in the end. That was really good. So I think I just want to ask Lynn now another question that you raised, and also I know Professor Trinidad also has mentioned that in your book. The idea of public-private partnership, you talk about adopting sites and adopting mosques, or the role of collaboration. Now that we try to maybe look at something else other than international organization. I know you wrote about this, and also Trinidad, you also wrote about that in the book. Maybe I give you to tell us a little bit more about how did you see aspects of public-private partnerships, or what you call it, adopting mosques, I think was it. So let us know a little bit about it.
Okay, so I think it's a really good segue into thinking about what it means to involve the community, right? I think thinking about partnerships. Yes, there's a part of the book where I follow this Adopt a Mosque initiative that actually didn't work out very well with all the abandoned mosques not in the city, right, but then across the desert. It didn't work so well because there was a problem of translation with the community who thought that is the job of our path. It's not the job of random man and woman on the street. So I think sometimes it's a reminder that sometimes these ideas are being imported, like, oh, this worked in California, let's try it here, without a lot of thinking about what does it mean to do this here, how does it translate, right? That's why I think of it as a problem of translation. But it's, I know Professor Meskell maybe has something more tangible to say about how a more exciting example, positive example of adoption, but it's also a good time for us to think about community and what this wonderful word sustainability brings to the table, and this is related to your chair position, right? How we can't just add community and stir, right? The expression, we can't just say, oh, now let's consult the community now that the project is done. A lot of what our work is demonstrating when you study it close to the ground, right? I lived in Qatar for 5 years of interviews, site visits, documentation, being involved in projects. A lot of that demonstrates that when something is not really rooted in local ideas, it just doesn't work so well. Or it works great for the Danish visitor, but it doesn't work for Qatar, right? So there's a question of ownership and care, like the idea of caring for heritage, like the root of like the idea of curating something. Like the idea is to care for something, take care of it like it's your child, like it's your parent, like it's your. So it's a good moment for me to plug that what we've seen in the last few days here in Oman is a huge amount of community-led initiatives that are wonderful. And I think that's the kind of partnership that we need to study next as a very positive thing. Not as something that is, oh, this is not how UNESCO does things, but as something that is just working so organically and so naturally. Right? I mean, to go back to the Adopt a Mosque, I know you have a different example.
Well, I was just going to say the best community-involved projects I've seen. I worked in India for 10 years, and I have to say that the work of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, particularly at Nizmuddin and Humayun's tomb, and I know the Aga Khan has worked elsewhere, obviously in Cairo. They still work in Afghanistan when many organizations cannot. To me, is one of the best examples of heritage and community and humanitarianism and uplift. And my colleague Ratish Nanda, who is CEO of Aga Khan in India, working in Hyderabad, about to work in Golconda Port and working in Delhi, is just inspirational. So it is possible. It just takes a care and thought. India is also the site where Adopt a Heritage. Unfortunately, Mr. Modi would not be interested in adopting a mosque, and I don't need to tell you why, but he was interested in Adopt a Monument, and that has been a private-public partnership, sometimes with unfortunate partners like cement companies that wanted to cement over the Red Fort and Mughal architecture. So some of that has not worked out very well. But also, I think it's similar to Trinidad's case, that communities got very upset. So there were many protests in Delhi because the idea of adoption meant that this monument, often Mughal monuments, were orphaned. So the language was unfortunate. So people took to the streets to protest in very angry terms that these monuments were not orphaned, that these were their local sites that they visited, that they went to mosque, they went to picnic, they went with their families to visit. So the adoption word, I think your comment is a good one. What might work in the US, like in some philanthropic, adopt a brick to build a museum, did not work in India, and people were highly offended. And they also felt that the Archaeological Survey of India, which is the biggest archaeological organization in the world, hiring conservators, engineers, that is what they're paid for. That is their job. So why should people and companies who know nothing about heritage or archaeology take over a site and do it what? Turn it into what? A Disneyland. So it is exactly as you say, an issue of translation of what works in one country. However, just the other caveat to that is, it is not the principle that necessarily is wrong. As I pointed out to several ministers in India, Italy and France have been doing this corporate partnership forever. Whether it's the Trevi Fountain in Rome, funded by the Fendi fashion label, Todd's Shoes did the Colosseum. We never criticize when the Italians do it. And they've done it for years. The French do it. Louis Vuitton funds everything, right? So if it's a fashion label, that's fine. But, why was this criticized in India? Possibly because of the language, of this issue of translation, of who did it, oversight. There are many issues. But I think, again, there is a tendency to think if it's done in Europe, it's fine. If it's done anywhere else, it's problematic. And I think that's what we have to push back on.
A very interesting topic, and I just came to my mind now that the whole area of awqaf and waqf and the role of the awqaf in our Islamic traditions and religion, and the role of the awqaf that will play in the protection of heritage has not been. I mean, Oman is one of the many of our even World Heritage sites, like Falaj al-Khatmin, for example, is partially owned by the awqaf here, and I think there is a lot of chance, and I think there's research that could take place to explore how could we deploy a concept like the Awqaf to really support the protection of heritage and to move it forward?
I'd like to add something about that, which I think is another little thing that was great to discover in my research. It's really important to understand why Awqaf is not consulted in a lot of these projects. This is not because it shouldn't be consulted, right, with heritage projects that have obviously fall under the remit of WAC. But it shows the importance of understanding the heritage history of a place. What institutions have been involved? What nationalities are the experts? Like, how much do they know about the local context, right? So I always tell my students, right, because I have MA and PhD students in my program, the first thing you do is you read and understand the story of who was involved. You know, the English came, and then the British came, and then Shell funded something. We need to understand the landscape of experts to understand why certain things have priority over other things. And obviously, you guys probably know, but in a place like Qatar, a lot of these projects were falling under big development projects that had foreign teams, almost exclusively foreign teams making decisions. So at some point I say something that's comical but true in the book, which is that the team designing some of the new mosques in Musharraf, in downtown Doha, were the same teams designing luxury spas, right? And the idea of these foreign architects making decisions about things and sidelining local agencies is very real. Of course, we can all laugh or get really angry about this, but it has to do with the history of heritage expertise in the region, right? And that's why it's so important. It's one of the topics I wanted to mention is local, training local experts, right? Like pushing back on these packaged experts. It doesn't matter if we're all local, but we all have degrees from Leiden University because the knowledge we acquired was generated somewhere else. So being in conversation with the global, but thinking about local values and ways of seeing the landscape is incredibly important.
Thank you. Thank you that you brought over the topic of education and heritage education and conservation. And we have a few young professionals here from Oman, Ryan and Zainab, and there's some really very few who have studied museum studies or maybe conservation. But I feel there is a lot of scope that we can do that and do that more, especially for our region. I mean, we also have Moses nodding in the back, studied museum studies and working at the National Museum. So we do have very few jewels, around, but I think we definitely need more. And this is really one of the roles of the chair with our, inshallah, hopefully soon, master's degree, focusing on that. We hope that we can graduate more people with interest in the field. Any questions from the floor? Yeah? You can.
First of all, thank you so much for the wonderful debate that you're having. It makes me wonder to think, is it not preservation if we keep the monument alive, if we keep using it? Doesn't that stay within the word of preservation and preserving the monument itself? And, another thing that I had in mind is putting or listing these monuments in the list. Was it not the whole point of drawing the attention and drawing the spotlight on these monuments so we can help to protect them and preserve them? However, as you said, it's became more of a conflict more than peace. However, what is the next step then for these monuments? How do we draw the attention and how do we keep them alive and preserve them if listing them is bringing more conflict than peace? And what do we do? How do we collaborate and, as you said, joining the community? Because one of the doctors who taught me in University of York, Dr. Louise, she said, I really wonder if a thing that has been stuck in my mind since then is when you're doing a research or when you're taking care of an artifact or a monument, the best thing that you can have is that sentimental connection with the place, because you're going to be the first one to protect that place? And do you have that love and passion so you will protect it? So what is the next step? That's my question. Thank you so much.
I think we know Louise. Do you know Louise? I think we know her from Turkey. These are really great questions. Everything you're raising is, again, very timely. I am not a good person to be the director of heritage preservation because I don't think everything should be preserved. Sometimes I think there's a certain organic nature to our societies where some things have stayed, other things have gone. And I understand how a lot of the literature in the field says that it has to be about emotion and attachment. But sometimes it's just next to the use. It has to be a logical reason why we preserve things. It has to be economically viable. That's why adaptive reuse is so interesting, right? It's about letting things become something else in a way that make you still feel connected. So I'm going to push back gently on this idea that it has to be about nostalgia or memory because society changes. And if I may add, that's part of the problem of how heritage is imposed on a place like the Arab world. Like it must stay the same. It has to stay the way it was before. And you guys are saying, well, but we're not the same people as we were before. We've preserved some traditions, we've adapted some modern things. We're not going to live in the same houses from the 1940s. And it's such a crazy Western notion to go to places and say, oh, why don't you live in traditional houses? I'm from Argentina. My people don't live in traditional houses, right? So it's not a one solution fits all. I think, again, it points to the importance of thinking about which monuments, do they still have relevance? Is there a community that cares for it in very practical ways? And not having no rules, letting things be reevaluated. We always say, it would be good to reevaluate heritage value, it just costs money. But it would be good to every now and then wonder, is this still us? You guys have heard about a lot of monuments being torn down in the United States. That has to do with society changing, with ideas of history changing, ideas of justice changing. We should all have that freedom. And a lot of the problem with putting heritage flags on things and stamps is that you take away the freedom to become better as a society, to evolve, to change your mind, right? So it's a double-edged sword, but it's a very good question that I cannot answer simply. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add, again, being Australian and doing my primary undergraduate training there, of course the importance of living heritage was central to that. And as I said, when those sites are nominated by the very people who understand those values and come from those places, we get more cooperation and conflict. The other statistic I would just share with you is that sites on the tentative list, and I know Trinidad showed for the Arab states, but sites on UNESCO's tentative list show more cooperation and conflict in our data. So what does that say? It says that preparing the plans, talking to people, all of those negotiations of inclusion are okay. It's when you inscribe, when governments inscribe and choose and select and then decide to displace people or not employ them or whatever else, many things can cause conflict. And as I said, I mean dissatisfaction, what I see in Italy, what I see in India, what I see in the UK, people feeling aggrieved at the UNESCO label. And you're absolutely right that leading up to the 1972 convention, the idea was we all these states, would pool our money and help sites in need, whether that was because of the Aswan Dam, the development decade. We would help Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan. We would help Tyre in Lebanon, which I have to say needs help again, right? And Tyre wasn't a natural disaster, it was an invasion and an attack. So really, if we had stuck to the original idea of what pooling that money was about to help, it wasn't about tourism and nation branding, it was actually about helping certain states. So who should we be thinking about helping now, right? And that means not just leaving countries when there's another crisis and an NGO wants to go somewhere else. So that would mean a sustained commitment to all sorts of countries. But of course, at the forefront of my mind right now when I see monasteries, mosques in Gaza. That would be what the fundraising was for. And of course Ukraine, of course Yemen, of course Lebanon again, but there are also other issues. Nepal, Japan even has natural disasters where it needs assistance. So it would be a global look and a global support for many states where the world would come together and learn about the site too, not just write the check, but actually learn about the culture. So we're missing an opportunity of the real notion of what that conservation movement could look like globally for this nation branding, very sort of economically driven, sort of European model of tourism.
Thank you. I just would like to bring in our audience who are very patient, our colleagues online, and maybe just involve them just quickly before I take Lopna's question. So we have a question, maybe Lynn, given your history with UNESCO. So, actually that's for both speakers. So we have a question from Ayman Al-Shweki, and he's asking about what are your thoughts on listing non-classical nominations such as rock art. Saudi Arabia had a lot of that, cultural landscapes in Arabia and Africa on the World Heritage List in the context of the dominance and preference historically shown towards classical monuments such as cathedrals and so on. So thank you, Ayman, for the question. I hope the sound is a bit clear now. And sorry for all the mishap with the connection, but we're good. So,
great question. And in fact, I was very struck listening to Trinidad's talk. Obviously I know the book, but listening again, I encourage you all to go onto the UNESCO website, and when it lists how you could search for sites, just put in the word church and cathedral and see how many hundreds of those 1,200 sites are religious sites. But because we have secularized the West, apparently, they don't count. But just have a look at the dominance in European sites. And then unfortunately, going to Ayman's question, many countries of the global south have also felt that the only way to get a listing or European support is to nominate the fort, the castle, the church, the cathedral, the plaza. So what you end up, and that doesn't matter whether it's African nations, Latin American nations, Asian nations, they've all had to play this game, so that what you end up doing is nominating the built heritage of your oppressors, which I think is a very unfortunate, instead of your indigenous heritage. So many African states have had to do the slave fort or the church rather than indigenous landscapes, for example. So rock art is terrific. Anything that diversifies the list, that also links natural landscape and cultural practices, that has a longevity to it, that is understood by living tradition. There's all sorts of ways of including those sites. We have to get away from I'm sorry to say here, but the fortress, the European fortress, or the European cathedral, or the European capital, or that sort of architecture. There's plenty of other things, and that will get your local buy-in. Australia did it too. We did convict sites, so we nominated our colonial overlords and celebrated that. Right now we do Aboriginal sites. So we learn, slowly, we learn.
Yes, thank you, Lily. I hope, Ayman, your sound was clear for that question. I know there is one more question. I'm very conscious of time. We also have some little, snacks where we can continue this conversation, but maybe, Luna, I have...
So I had a question about, it's also about the communities and how they relate to UNESCO. The connection between the two. It was really interesting to hear that, in Mosul, they wanted the souk to be revived. And I kind of thought about the living, like people are more concerned about living their lives and living a decent life, whereas what we heard before about UNESCO is that they're more, the mission was spreading world peace in very simplistic terms. But so is there a disconnect now? Like, does UNESCO need to revise its mission? Does it need to, is that the reason why? And also just to add on it, Dr. Meskell, you mentioned that the Aga Khan Trust is a very great example of like an organization that works really well with local communities and does really good work. Where's the difference between what UNESCO is doing and how UNESCO maybe is structured in their mission versus what the Aga Khan's doing and why they're doing it, how they're doing it better? And is it a core mission thing or is it a structural thing because they're more connected to communities? Just something along those lines.
Yeah, great question, thank you. UNESCO folks would always say we are not a development agency. If I heard that once, I heard it 100 times. We don't do development. Well, funnily enough, in the old days, in the 40s and 50s they did, but they don't anymore. And things like the withdrawal of US funding from 2011 onwards has hampered any attempts to have a kind of humanitarian funding element to it. Aga Khan sees its heritage conservation work as a way of uplifting the community. So if you work at Humayun's tomb, and they have just the best work I think I've ever seen in India, plus this incredible museum, plus Nizamuddin Basti, they have provided all the services that the state will not provide, whether that's sanitation, education, hospitals, clinics, all sorts of computer training, women's literacy, you name it, they've done it. I would encourage you all to look at those incredible projects. So that's their mission. And really, it would have been a great mission if UNESCO had adopted it, but it's led by the states, right? It's the United Nations. So who can we blame? When the Americans say to me, well, you've given a grim picture of UNESCO, why should we pay money? Well, this is what happens when you don't. You should participate and you should learn from that, as it were. Aga Khan, it's the vision of an incredible family, but it's a vision that we can all share. And there are, as I said, other NGOs that do fantastic work and very necessary work. The example, whether it's Mosul or, Aleppo is even better, and I feel embarrassed speaking in front of Hiba, who knows this much better than me, and it shouldn't be surprising, given the list of priorities. People want help during and after conflict. People want healthcare, they want education, they want security. And if they're going to pick a site to work on, maybe it's not Palmyra. And I cannot tell you how many pictures we all have to live with. Palmyra and the replicas of Palmyra that circulate in the West, it goes back to what Trini said about representation, translation. That's not helping anyone. The archaeological site of Palmyra is, magnificent. It's already been reconstructed once by the French, let's face it, 100 years ago. It's still going to be reconstructed. What people want is that linkage between development, economic opportunity, also a multi-ethnic, multi-religious space, which is more likely to happen in Aleppo's souk. And funnily enough, that's where Aga Khan has worked. It is not rocket science. It's just, it's just so obvious, but it's so necessary, and very few agencies think like that. I think World Monuments is another one, based in the United States, believe it or not, is trying to do something similar, working with the ground up. But, we've been fixated on certain monuments. Who said classical monuments as well? We have a surfeit of those. We don't need any more churches. We don't need any more cathedrals on the list. We don't need any more classical sites. We need a diversity. It's world heritage,
But also, if I can add something really brief to your great question, you don't need to nominate things to UNESCO to care for your culture. We've been doing fine without. So there's many things. There's an evaluation of the cost-benefit analysis in consideration of all the negative things we know now, the positive, is it attached to the tourism industry? Those things matter. You put it all on the table, but not everything needs to be UNESCO nominated, and you can still, talking about your question, you can still care for it, taking care of it helping it grow with you, with your society, with your values. So you can have both systems at the same time in one country.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the time. I think I'll give the chance one more time to the people online. And we have a question. A question from Mus'ab Amir Abu Hazem. Very interesting. He's raising the question. He's a specialist in artificial intelligence. And he's raising the question of as a specialist in artificial intelligence and cultural heritage, I'm particularly interested in how AI can support the documentation and safeguarding of intangible heritage, especially traditions, oral expressions, etc., given the historical focus on monumental and tangible heritage, particularly from Europe, and how do we see the role of AI in amplifying visibility of intangible heritage in regions such as Arabia and Africa, and would that help to shift the balance? Yeah.
This is briefly one of those questions where I wish you were here to elaborate a little bit more, because I'm not that familiar with the ways in which technology can help us solve these questions that have to do with a conflict of values, with the forces of colonialism, with being, it's no accident that you're listening to this talk by the hands of an Australian and an Argentinian, right? And bringing the power, the knowledge to other centers of gravity. It would have been great to have more of a conversation with this person, but I'm not that. What I do want to say briefly is I'm very suspicious of technology solving any of these problems at the moment. I think we need conversations, and we need understanding, we need a level playing field. That is not gonna happen with more 3D scanning.
Yeah, if I could just add, and I am going to invoke the Arch of Baal from Palmyra that was 3D reconstructed from a group in Oxford with some Italian stone, and that went to New York, London, Florence, and maybe Berlin. Did it go to Syria? Did it go to Iraq? Did it come to Palestine? No. So all the tech in the world just reinforces the same inequities. And I don't think even that people even considered that a replica might be appreciated even by Syrians who might be in Jordan. But no, I mean, it's a great gadget, but I think Trinidad's right. We can't assume that more tech is going to solve the disparities. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just give myself the liberty to ask Dr. Ali Al-Hashmi, Professor of Architecture at Sultan Qaboos University, and the recent winner of His Majesty's grant for cultural heritage. Really, we're very proud of all your work, and maybe you have something to say about this issue of documentation and intervention of technology.
Hello everyone. You put me in the spot. First of all, thank you for the presentation, and I was really enjoying myself. One thing I do agree with you, adding more tech doesn't really solve anything, or doesn't really, it's not you can say, it's not a one-stop solution for everything. However, one thing that tech is extremely important in is having kind of like a archiving, like we understanding or having this geometric information of all the sites that we're having. And along with that, there's one aspect of non-geometric information, whether it's material, whether it's like, what is it exactly? So that for us is like the first step. All this stuff that you have talked about, it comes in, but we lack that step and that first step. And we're trying to, overcome that in order to be able to have a unified archive system where we have all this information that we can update. I'm not sure if I can ask the question because
I just want to say to Kura, we would make great colleagues. I agree with you.
True. So my question was about the community engagement that we have, that everyone actually asked about. My question is about the enabling part of the community. I do believe, of course, the community has to be part of any intervention, any
restoration, whatever is going to happen to the site. But do we talk about the enabling them? There are some aspects that they lack or they probably don't know how to deal with. It's a heritage management. They don't know about these things. The site is important for them for some reason. But other than that, they sometimes don't know how to deal with it. For them, sometimes replacing it, a portion that had been demolished with a concrete is you can say a go-to move for them. So, is there any aspect about this enabling part where it's not just about involving them, but also educating them on how to deal with these sites?
Yeah, I thank you. There's like a whole other topic we'll be having about what we saw in Oman in the past 4 days. You don't have the problem of a community that is not engaged. This is incredible. I've never seen anything like that. If I were to start a project here or had a PhD student that wanted to work on this, the great question here is, what should be the local way of dealing with heritage? So what if somebody wants to replace something with something else, and that is the way your people want to do it, right? So it's so hard for us to step away from what we think is the norm because it's the international standard, and then ask the question to the community of what do you think should happen here before we tell them what to do. It's an ideal situation, right? It's difficult because at the same time you're archiving, you're safeguarding. So the complication is finding a way of doing both. Yeah. But starting with asking instead of telling would be the next stage of the future of heritage, I think.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm just responding here as well. I am very conscious of time, and I just really would like to, maybe wrap up by asking both Lynn and Trinidad to share with us one recommendation. Not the consultant, but we can play the consultant. Now, you've been here, as you said, for 4 days. We walked around the old city in Matra, in Muscat. We went to Bahla, where we are now working on a big project. You went to Jabal Akhdar, and I think tomorrow also you're heading to Qalhat, another World Heritage site, to explore. And later on, you're going to go to the National Museum, etc. So, what would you advise us, especially redirected to the chair as an entity that maybe with a bit of support and dedication could make a difference? So I'll give you the mic.
Thank you. Really briefly what I just said. Ask before you tell. Ask more questions. Yes, it's important to archive what you have in terms of the material resources, but what does caring for your culture in Oman look in 2025, right? Send your students out to ask questions before we tell people what to do. I mean, that to me that's the treasure. Learn from how things have been done. A lot of things have survived because people took care of them. So something's working really well here. And you need to collect that information.
Yeah, I think that's great. For the local perspective, I agree. Always ask, never assume. I would say on the international perspective, I would love to see Oman host the World Heritage meetings and bring the world here and showcase the best that you have, which is living, traditional, cultural, natural, a different story perhaps of the Middle East, of interconnection of all of the countries in which Oman is connected to, and really educate people, because we may be from abroad, but we often know very little, right? So the intangible, the tangible, sort of put it all together in your own particular style. And that, I know that Oman necessarily might not take a very political stance, but if you're on the committee, which I know the Omani delegation has been, you have incredible power. When you're on that committee of 21 states, you are UNESCO. So you can decide who to support, what causes need supporting, what people, how to do it different. The power is in your hands, and so use it for good.
Well, Oman hosting the World Heritage Committee we have here. Sam from the World Heritage. She can take our message back to His Excellency the Minister and say we're ready for it. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, once again. Thank you very much to the Historical Association of Oman for being with us today, and for all the colleagues. Asad came all the way from Nizwa to be with us, and everybody else who showed interest in this session. And please keep following the chair. And if you register on the QR code, we'll be able to send you more information, and we'll be able to work with you on future topics. Thank you very much, Lynn and Trinidad. Thank you. I hope to see you again. Thank you.